Good morning. We're going to talk about the Black Panther today. Try to put it into some context for with the other books we've read. Try to see if we can carry through a couple of the things that we talked about on Friday, and just try to deal with the book as something written by a public intellectual in a form that public intellectuals rarely deal with. First, I'm going to begin with a non-lit term du jour, terroir. And terroir is the complete natural environment in which a particular wine is produced. And it seems to me that one cannot look at T'Challa the Black Panther without looking at Wakanda, and that the natural environment of Wakanda, its minerals, its history, its borders, its isolation, all of those things created this fictional technologically advanced African nation, and it created the Black Panther. If you take a look at the concluding part of the uh, book, there's a interview with Brian Stelfreeze, and he discusses the fact that he thought the nation of Wakanda was one of the biggest characters in the book. And he wants the country to have a duality of old world and city of the future. And for him, this juxtaposition should talk about a strong cultural heritage, and it should also hint at an idea of schism. The idea of schism is inherent in T'Challa. I'll talk more about that in a couple of slides. But there's also this idea of if something bad happens to T'Challa, the schism within Wakanda will widen and the country will break apart. The Queen talks about the idea that the country will rupture. Now, again, his sister had been monarch before him. His sister had been the acting Black Panther before him, and there was a rupture between T'Challa and his sister. But there is also, I think, inherent within this idea of what will happen if, in such a short space of time, you have the death of his father, the death of his sister, and his death, and the Black Panthers are seeming to just fall like dominoes getting tipped over all of the time. Also, I think it gets set up very, very simply that the Dora Milaje, the bodyguards of the Black Panther, are the emblem of the country. They are the blood alloy of Wakanda itself. And once there's a rupture between them and the Black Panther, there's a rupture between tradition and everything else. And you'll also take a look at that rupture in tradition with his father basically saying that, he's not worthy. And you also have other monarchs. Dr. Doom invades, the Submariner chides him for not caring enough about being, his place in the monarchy. And so you have this idea that the blood alloy is kind of rejecting T'Challa, and there's this kind of schism that's going on between the land and the king. Coates, however, doesn't want us to go too far down the path that T'Challa is totally split from his country. In fact, the idea of terroir, I think, applies with this quotation that you can see right now. He's interested in why he's king. He's interested in whether he's not interested in why he's king. He's interested in, whether he should be king. And I think there's an interest with this idea of what the relationship with Wakanda should be. And because Wakanda is having a schism, he's having this schism trying to figure out what's going on and what should my relationship be. The terroir, the focus of the land and how it ties into T'Challa, I think, is key. And so the non-lit term du jour, I think, applies here. All semester, we've talked about character, conflict, connection, and theme. And I want to run through and hit some of the character tropes that I think fall within the superhero genre, talk about the conflicts inherent within the four issues we've read, the connections that Coates pulls in, and how we can connect them to other books we've read. And although I'll probably only be talking more about subject matter than theme, I think it'll still work. The first appearance of the Black Panther, he tricked the Fantastic Four into coming to Wakanda. He tries to beat them 1-on-4, and he does. He loses out 1-on-5 because of Wyatt Wingfoot. Excuse me. But even at the end of that experience, Reed Richards talks about the idea that T'Challa is this man of honor. He does not dishonor his word. He doesn't give it lightly. He is this person of royal presence, almost, I think is inherent within this quotation. I think there's, again, a schism. I think there's a break because he goes beyond being a king, according to the Queen Mother. His sister gave herself for the nation, and the mother, Wamanda, is saying that T'Challa goes too far and he's giving himself to the world. That he, as a king, should be linked to the land. And I'm coming back to that terroir thing a little bit. This quotation could easily fit up in there and in that section of the presentation. And I think it's important to understand that this break from tradition, this break from everything, is key to the book. But it still doesn't deny the fact that he is a product of Wakanda. You could not have him be a product of New York City. You could not have him be a product of London. There are two internal conflicts, or actually, there's several internal conflicts, but I want to focus on two in this slide. One is this idea of being divided from the people, from his sister. All right. The second one is this idea of being king. He's never truly given himself to the country. He feels the crown's a burden, not necessarily an honor. And because of that, it's an internal conflict about how can I be king? How should I be king? It's what Coates was talking about earlier in the prose version as he's describing it. Now he has his words get channeled through the Queen Mother to T'Challa, explaining the idea of royalty and what it think about being a king. It is a burden and an honor. Deal with it both. And he seems to be fighting that internally. Comic books have external conflicts. That's what they thrive on. So you have T'Challa versus Senzi, Tattoo, and Stain at the tail end of book 4. You have T'Challa fighting death because he wants to bring his sister back to life. And if you take a look at several of those scenes, his technology has the resurrection protocol. I didn't have time to put it in the previous presentation, and I don't have time to really deal with it right now in this presentation either. But there's an argument to be made that one of the things that makes a superhero is the fact that they're kind of immune to death, that they always seem to come back. Superman died and came back. It just seems to be part of the superhero mythos, especially in the late 90s through the 20 teens. And obviously, there's physical fight scenes. T'Challa also talks about the idea of there were all these conflicts in the past. Doctor Doom invaded, Prince Namor invaded, the Black Order, which was this death cult, invaded. They were from outer space. And he is fighting all of these external conflicts along with the internal conflict about how can I be a good king? On the third book, as we begin, there is some gorgeous, gorgeous artwork. Stelfreeze, I think, outdid himself on that artwork. And then there is this long, poetic sequence. And it's poetic for a reason. It comes from the poem Root Song. And the poem Root Song is something that Coates talks about as being an influential poem in his life, even though it's not something that gets studied in school very often. Coates talks about the idea that the poem uses black myth to construct this story before and after colonialism and enslavement. And he also links it to the romance, and I think we're using the term romance here in the sense of the chivalric knight and the power of romantic story, not the romance that we were dealing with in the Hunger Games. But he links it to another comic book, Marvel's Thor. He links poetry to comic books in general. It requires a ruthless efficiency with words. Remember that poetry, at least one of my colleagues used to call it, is the best words in the best order. And here, I think you see the fact that comics, because of the need to have pictures, have to be very economical with words because you don't want to take away from the art. And he talks about the idea of the art and the words being the key part about the beginning of Black Panther 3, and that the art, particularly in the pages using root song, is the heroic element of that issue. Theme. Remember that theme always begins with the subject matter, and that the subject matter is always about one or two words, and the theme is the points being made about those words. I think you can also go back to the Friday presentation and talk about resonating with the situations that superheroes find themselves in. So certainly the idea of agony and humiliation and sadness, and apparently agony is really important, so I have it in there twice. But rage and grief and guilt, we all resonate with those. We all have to deal with the fallout of those, just like T'Challa does. There are, however, some more serious external adult issues: human trafficking, what constitutes good government, how to deal with the past, and how to deal with a traumatic past as a nation. And certainly throughout this presentation, I hope I've made clear that T'Challa is facing a duty versus a desire, and that's an internal conflict that I think a lot of people have to deal with. To wrap it up, I want to point out again, Coates is a public intellectual, and comic books are not usually reviewed in the LA Review of Books. The only reason this one is because that Coates wrote it. It begins with his idea that this book can be a little talky and boring. I think that's an aesthetic judgment that we can go through and debate. I found it pretty interesting. But the last sentence is what I really want to point out here. At its best, Black Panther's a sign what Coates will be capable of in the superhero genre. And the comic book medium, given time and perhaps a bit more faith in their visionary dimensions. The idea of visionary dimension was something we talked about Friday, with the idea that this is one of the things comic books are doing in the 21st century, they're replacing the Western. And thinking in complex ways about nation states, democracy, individual power, and autocrats, I think is a big chunk of what the world is dealing with right now. And I think it's a big chunk of what Coates can do, or Coates did do, with his run on the Black Panther. We're going to pick up Hatchet next. Hatchet is a different sort of book than the Black Panther. And we remember that your final essay is due on Friday. Your final lit analysis essay is due on Friday. Your paper for Hatchet and the Hatchet quiz are due Monday. Hope you're all ready for a good week as we wrap up the semester.